Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second event in the 2024 Experience Columbia Summer Program. Every summer, we host special events to connect you with our senior scholars, provide an opportunity to hear about their work, and connect you with them and each other. This summer, our events highlight our summer focus areas, which include arts and culture in New York City and Wall Street prep, economics, finance, and analytics, among others. This event, The Whale of Wall Street, highlights not only Wall Street, but also arts and culture in New York City. Tonight's conversation features two esteemed Columbia faculty, the Journalism School's Professor Winnie O'Kelly and the School of the Arts Professor David Henry Hwang. Winnie O'Kelly is a veteran journalist with an outstanding career as an editor in business and finance who has often specialized in corporate wrongdoing. She spent 20 years at the New York Times in various leadership roles, overseeing the biggest financial stories, including Enron's collapse, the dot-com bust, the mortgage crisis, and the Bernie Madoff fraud. She edited a Pulitzer Prize-winning series on tax avoidance by David Kochanevsky and managed the paper's coverage of the 2008 financial crisis, as well as Wall Street's efforts to return to normal after 9/11. More recently, she served as executive editor at Bloomberg News, covering government, legal issues, and financial regulation around the world, overseeing stories at the intersection of power and business. While teaching at Columbia, she ran a global financial investigations team at Bloomberg that reported on everything from Russian money laundering to corporate accounting shenanigans to criminal hacking. That group followed the threads of the Jolo scandal from Malaysia to Goldman Sachs and around the world. O'Kelly is a recipient of the Editor of the Year Award, known as the Lawrence Menard Award from the Gerald Loeb Foundation. She earned a bachelor's degree in journalism from Northwestern University. David Henry Hwang's staged work include the plays M. Butterfly, Yellow Face, with a Broadway revival upcoming in the fall of 2024, Chinglish, Golden Child, The Dance and the Railroad, and FOB, as well as the musicals Soft Power, Aida, Flower Drum Song, and Disney's Tarzan. Called America's most produced living librettist by Opera News, he has written 3 libretti, including 5 with composer Philip Glass. Ina Damar, with music by Osvaldo Goldov, will receive its Metropolitan Opera premiere in fall 2024. His screenplays include M. Butterfly, and he is penning an Anna May Wong biopic to star actress Jenna Chan, as well as a musical feature for Paramount Pictures. Hwang co-wrote the Gold Record Solo with the late pop music icon Prince and was a writer, consulting producer for the Golden Globe winning television series The Affair from 2015 to 2019. He is currently showrunning and creating a new television series, Billion Dollar Whale. A professor at Columbia University School of the Arts, Hwang is a Tony Award winner and 3-time nominee, a Grammy Award winner and 2-time nominee, a 3-time Obie Award winner, and a 3-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. He was inducted into the Theater Hall of Fame in 2018 and the Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2021. His star was unveiled on the Lucille Lortel Playwright Sidewalk in 2022. Moderating this evening's conversation is Louise Rosen. Louise is the Senior Associate Dean of Administrative Affairs and Communications at the School of Professional Studies and a lecturer in International and Public Affairs at the School of International and Public Affairs here at Columbia University. Please join me in welcoming our moderator and speakers for this evening's conversation on the Whale of Wall Street. Louise?
Thank you both for being here. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with you and with all of our friends in the audience. I'd like to kick off by asking you, Winnie, if you don't mind, of just letting us know how you first came to this story and where you first picked up the breadcrumbs of the Jolo trail.
Well, it started when I was at Bloomberg News, and I hadn't been there for very long, and I was working in New York, and an editor came and said that out of Malaysia, there were reports of this corruption. And originally, actually the way it surfaced was someone was trying to sell the information. And as journalists, we don't pay for information. It's pretty hardwired into our ethics code that we just don't do that, at least not in New York. I know it's kind of famous right now because the Wall Street Journal, there's some discussion about when you can and can't pay for information. So we couldn't pay for it, but people wanted to get to the bottom of it. So there were these inklings that Malaysia, which was known for corruption, had something that was even bigger than normal. And I think the thing that really set people going was that the Prime Minister's wife went on these incredible shopping sprees. Hundreds of purses, giant jewelry, and she was the Prime Minister's wife from a very modest background. So that was the beginning.
Got it. What was unique about the scale of this versus you mentioned that this was so much bigger? And we refer to it as the $1 billion whale, but it's not actually $1 billion, is it? Several more than that. Is there, can you, without putting you on the spot while putting you on the spot,
Right.
What actually do we understand, do you understand to be the scale of the fraud at this point? Where are we now?
So first off, don't anyone hold me here to any specific number, okay? The numbers have changed so much over the years. And furthermore, you have to work on currency conversions from like a decade ago to now, but it's billions of dollars. There were underwritings led by Goldman Sachs in the neighborhood of $6 billion that were going to go into a fund that was intended to develop parts of Malaysia that desperately needed it. It was also supposed to be helpful for the environment. There was going to be this green kind of development. There would be commercial development. It was going to help fuel hospitals and other kinds of things that would help the people in what still is very much a developing country. And when you think ultimately about what we learned after a long period of time, it touched like every continent and dozens of countries where money was flowing out into Hollywood, into Abu Dhabi, into Singapore, and Luxembourg, Australia, investigations literally in dozens of countries.
So one of the things that we're going to talk about tonight, among many, is the challenge of telling stories like this, uncovering stories like this, and then adapting a story like this. How did you, as a reporter, how did you uncover it? You mentioned that you weren't able to purchase the first source's information. What was the process like in many respects for you, uncovering your first iteration and then continuing?
Okay, so first I have to be completely honest. I'm an editor, okay? And I was working with a lot of very talented reporters. Some of them there, many of them in this country. I was running an investigations team that was used to ferreting out money laundering and fraud, working to uncover very opaque investments, usually hidden in LLCs, created in countries where there's not much transparency at all. So that was the digging process. But honestly, a lot of the first stuff was just trying to figure out, wait a minute, Goldman Sachs underwrote these bonds for Malaysia to build stuff. Where's the money? Who at Goldman Sachs was involved? What happened? And at the same time, people in Malaysia were reporting back, you know, the Prime Minister's wife lives really, really well. She gets on a private jet and goes on these shopping sprees and comes back with like literally jet planes full of goods. So that was coming in too. And then it started popping up that this very strange character, Jolo, I guess it's appropriate we're in the low building here today.
We did it on purpose.
That he was living this high life and he'd been involved, even though he officially was nothing in this sovereign fund. So there were all these like dribs and drabs. So like Entertainment Tonight was covering Jolo, right? And Variety and those kinds of things. And the Malaysian press was sort of covering, you know, this woman who was living really well in Malaysia a little bit. And then you had people asking questions, but they were having trouble connecting all the dots. So it took literally years to do that.
Wow. David, this isn't your first time with business stories, but could you tell us and introduce us to what it is and how it is you're working on the $1 billion story?
So I found out about the story considerably later after I was I guess it was like 2.5 years ago now. I was on vacation and I got a call from a writer-producer named Beau Willimon, who's also a playwright. And you may know Bo from having created and showrun the American version of House of Cards. So it was originally a British series, and he adapted it for American television, and it, you probably remember, became the first original Netflix series. So it really kind of kicked off an era. And Bo's someone I know as a playwright more than as a television writer. But Bo and his company, Westward, had become involved with this project based on a book called Billion Dollar Whale by two Wall Street Journal reporters. Now, I just think of them as Tom and Bradley, but it's Bradley Hope and Tom, anyone knows. And it's about the Jolo story, and they were working to adapt it to into a TV series. Initially, it was thought that it would be a limited series, but I'll talk more about how it evolved subsequently. And and they asked me if I wanted to write the pilot and run the show. I had, in my credits, worked on a TV show called The Affair for 4 years. So I'd had the experience of writing and producing on a TV show, but not running it. And for those of you who are not familiar with the distinction, the showrunner is essentially the decider of the TV show, sets the tone, makes all the decisions, the CEO of the TV show, if you will.
Like the editor, though.
Yes, kind of like the editor, but also writes. But I assume some editors write.
Actually, I read a lot, yeah.
Or rewrite a lot.
Yeah.
You're my editor.
And showrunners rewrite. So I read the book and I was fascinated by it. I'd had some vague sense of, oh yeah, there was somebody who financed Wolf of Wall Street. But I also felt, all this financial stuff, I'm not very good with this. And I'm bad with my own finances. And when you start sort of looking at numbers and ledgers and things like that, my eyes sort of glaze over. So, and I may not be the best person for this. But they kept on, pushing and encouraging me. And I eventually came up with a way that I wanted to tell the story. And I can go into that now, or we can save that for later.
Let's save it for later. Only because I'd like to touch upon, and I say this as a former business reporter and business journalist, the challenge of telling a business story to those who are not consuming the numbers, putting the faces to the ledger in many respects. What is it that you think makes business stories so compelling beyond those who are reading them for the purposes of making an investment? Why do they permeate popular culture so much as well?
Well, I always tell everyone who's asking people questions, people think like sex is the taboo topic you can't ask people. Wrong, it's money. Money is the one topic people run from. They don't want to tell you about it. They keep it hidden as much as possible. And so getting into that and revealing what's actually going on is really very interesting because you're getting to the inside of where people put their values in many ways. But more than that, it's about power, right? I mean, whoever has the money has the power. And so if you're trying to strip that away and show either how they got the power or how they're trying to accrue the power, I think that really does a lot more than just telling a story of numbers. I don't know, maybe you feel differently.
No, I think that in some sense, when I reacted by saying, I don't really understand this stuff, that was a plus. Because in order to try to translate this story to a popular audience, it is fair to assume that although the audience wants to know about some of these sort of power issues and the degree to which they become sexy and the kind of intrigue, they're not really all that interested in the dry numbers either. And several people have said to me who work in finance that they're surprised that this is being made into a television show because it feels to them like kind of a dry ledgers story. So I feel like both those things are true.
But I gotta say, it is nothing like a dry ledger story. I mean, the characters in this are a field day. I mean, just one example, just one. and I'll go back, Tim Leisner, who was Goldman Sachs character. He was responsible for the Asia unit, which was selling to Malaysia, hey, we'll go underwrite these bonds for you and you'll have all this money. Like, not only was he married to Kimora Lee Simmons, whose baby fat, her husband was, Def Jam and all that, Russell Simmons. They were having this crazy relationship that was going all kinds of places. Money was going all sorts of ways. They were doing their own investments and siphoning money off. He had he went by the name doctor, but he had a degree from a mill, a post office box that was mailed to him. His MBA was nothing. His character was just like a made-up character, just like Jolo. So even the heady, responsible people, the Goldman Sachs and imprimaturs, they were just a sham for who they really were. It's more so than like a Dallas or Dynasty, right? These characters are incredible.
My dad did that too. He called himself doctor. So again, I kind of related to a lot of these things, particularly when he made restaurant reservations.
And did that help?
It apparently did. I don't see why that would actually help, but he believed it did. So.
Okay, so I'm going to skip around now. I'm not going to keep you, because I have to ask you this question. It was something I touched upon with Winnie beforehand, but both of you have uncovered frauds. You have reported on many things, not just this, but Madoff and others. You have written about different deceptions and presentations. Is there an alchemy to a con? Is there an alchemy to deception, whether it is from the person who is being deceived or by the one who's perpetrating it?
You want to start?
No, because I can talk about how I fictionalized it, and I have an answer, but I feel like you might want to talk about the reality first.
I think the greed is always there, right? And once the greed starts, you get in this incredible cycle to keep it going. Right? You've got to keep it going. Who would have guessed that they would have siphoned so many billions of dollars? I mean, corruption occurs in Malaysia, as it does in many places, including the United States. But on this scale, it was extraordinary. So I think once they started, it was addictive. Same thing whether it's Bernie Madoff, right? He starts with sort of a small-scale fraud, Ponzi scheme, but to keep it going, he has to keep getting bigger and bigger and bringing in more suckers. And no matter who that is, that's sort of the way it flows. Now, what's your fictionalization?
So when I was thinking about this story, I think it's worth to clarify for those of you who don't know that we're talking about Jolo, who's this building is not named after, and who's at the center of this fraud. And when it started, he was in his 20s. He was a kid who ended up with probably more disposable income, just in terms of pure cash available to him than anybody else on the planet, and spent it on. We've talked about yachts. We've talked about I don't know if we talked about yachts, but on
We will.
real estate and art and yachts, and fully financed the movie Wolf of Wall Street, among other things. So when I was thinking about this, trying to decide if I had a take on the story, it relates to this very question that you raise, which is, how do people get conned? How does a successful con happen? And I started to think about the structure of the movie Wolf of Wall Street. So most of you have seen it probably, and the Jordan Belfort character, Leo DiCaprio's character, he has a direct address to the audience, so he speaks directly to camera. So he's the narrator. You're understanding the story through him. And very early on, there's a scene in The Wolf of Wall Street where Jordan Belfort is trying to explain to us what an IPO is. And he starts, and then he interrupts himself and says something to the effect of, but you don't really care about this. What you really want to know is, was it legal or not? And it was 100% illegal. Mm-hmm. And so he is the narrator, and we believe him, and he is actually being transparent. So what I thought might be interesting, and I didn't think I'd seen before, would be to do a story in which we use the Wolf of Wall Street structure. So Jolo becomes the Jordan Belfort character, right, who's speaking to us directly. But It's a TV series that attempts to con the audience. So we have an unreliable narrator who, for the first, initially I thought 9 or 10 episodes. So let's say you have a 9 or 10 episode season. I mean, we ended up with 9, but initially I was thinking of 10. So I thought, okay, so at the beginning of the series, we are letting Jolo, the unreliable narrator, tell us about, or we're listening to Jolo, the unreliable narrator, trying to explain how this happened. And we are seeing the events from his point of view, or at least how he wants us to see them. So it's as if there was a television show created by Joe where he was the showrunner. But as we start to go through the series, we should begin to, what Joe is telling us should begin to contradict some of the things that we're seeing. And we should begin to see through this facade. And the idea would be to recapitulate the experience of being conned by him. That we, the audience, will be conned by him at the beginning, and by different audience members will sort of start to figure it out at different points. But by episode 5 or 6, we should be really clear that we have been conned and that he actually is the criminal that he has been accused of. So once I had that take, then I felt like, okay, I can write this.
It's interesting that you mention and jump into The Wolf of Wall Street. I think when I was revisiting the book for our conversation, it popped out to me in the same way it did the first time I read it, when Jordan Belfort is at the party, I think in Nevada, and he turns around to his date that night and said, "This is all stolen money. There's no way you would do this if it was your own." And the fact that he twigs, but everybody else there hasn't, and is buying into the avarice. Are there certain aspects of the story that are more entertaining to tell than others? I think about that. The yacht, is there something in particular that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that happens on a yacht in the series. The story that you're telling about Jordan Belfort is Joe throws himself in, I want to say 2016. It's not 2016. It's earlier than that, 2012 or 2013. Anyway, he throws himself the biggest birthday party in the history of Las Vegas. And, the Kardashians are there, and De Niro's there, and Britney Spears pops out of a cake and sings happy birthday to him. And Jordan Belfort is also invited to that party. And he says to his date, "Oh, this has got to be stolen money. Nobody who actually makes this money, makes the money, spends it this way." And that happens for us in episode 6. And we are, by that point, everybody in the audience should know that this is a con. I think I didn't answer the question you just asked.
Are there aspects are there certain events that took place that are more fun for you to be able to tell, or are they more what are the high points and the low points, or challenges in doing
so
this?
all the excess stuff is of course, fun to tell, and that's why we watch Succession and a lot of, to sort of watch that level of excess. But ultimately, you still have to have an emotional through line, because you can't just run anything, a musical, a TV show, on sort of the spectacle alone. It just becomes kind of, it starts to taste weird after a while, unless there's something that's more substantial. And so after I thought, okay, we'll, do this approach where Joe will con the audience, then we also started to think about what is the family story here? Because so many of these TV shows that are about other things, there's a theory that all TV shows are ultimately about families. And I don't know if I completely buy that, but certainly family, or some sort of family, found family, work family, is an important component of why we are attracted to certain shows and why we continue to watch them. So this also seemed to me to be a story of sort of birth family versus found family. So I'm interested in sort of the role that, that Joe's birth family plays and how he's trying to make up for a certain moment in the family history when the father lost all their money. And so they've been in a hole, and I think this is pretty much true. The family has been in a financial hole since that time, and they've sort of clawed themselves back up, but they are still somewhat in debt. And so there's a kind of Oedipal thing that's going on between Joe and his father, Larry. And so there is his birth family, and then there's the found family of the Razaks, which are the prime minister and the prime minister's wife, and that in some sense Joe becomes more attracted to the Razaks, which then exacerbates the sort of competition between himself and his father and creates this other weird Oedipal bond between Joe and Rosma, the prime minister's wife. So, there are some people who theorize that Joe was the kind of mastermind of all of the financial shenanigans and corruption. And then there are other people, and that Najib Razak, the prime minister, that Najib sort of went along with that. But I mean, certainly happy to get the money. And then there are other people, in terms of the world of reporters, who feel that, no, Najib was always the one in charge. And Joe was someone who was trying to meet the needs of the Razaks. And I think there's some truth to both of those. And so therefore, the notion of how Joe gets entangled with the Razaks and both how he benefits from it and he becomes sort of a surrogate son in a way to Rosma, and there is a weird Oedipal thing there. That axis becomes a way to create a family story within this financial story.
Wow, I can't wait. Having read, I can't wait to see the show. One of the things that I want for us to talk a little bit about the New York landscape, both financial and artistic, that enabled this fraud to happen, and in many respects, the creative team that will bring the show to bear. But just before we do that, we've spoken about the size of the fraud, and I think about this in some respects. It's so big that to be able to understand it or to be able to see who's impacted by it. Because at the end of the day, there are those fantastical, and they're not, I mean, they are real, the parties, the yachts, the insane gifts, the girlfriends, the friends, all the rest of it. But this has had a significant impact on people on the ground in Malaysia. I mean, this fund was set up in order to be able to facilitate development projects on the ground there in a country that, as we were talking about before, is still in the process of developing. What has been the impact on the ground? What were the projects that didn't happen and are still stymied? And how do you put a face on those numbers? Because people's lives have been impacted. I think about when Mayor first happened, it was like, oh, nobody. And then you start hearing about people's life savings, their retirements, the homes that they're losing. Is there a way to put a face on those who have been impacted, whose lives are not better because this money has been stolen, and they're very real?
That's hard, and I was going to say that was the criticism of The Wolf of Wall Street. Mm-hmm. It's Jordan Belfort, who is this character who's doing pump and dump schemes on Wall Street, buy this penny stock and pushing up the price, right? And he wrote his autobiography, which became The Wolf of Wall Street, and it was pretty heavily criticized for not taking into account for all the people whose lives were lost. He made himself the center of attention and the grandiose character in many ways. And you have the same challenge with this other tale now. It's hard to show the absence of things, right? So it's about the things that didn't happen to many degrees. It's the things that didn't get built. Malaysia was trying to move to a more environmentally sound future. It was going to do these big development complexes that would be, environmentally sound, that were going to help, help bring in more tax dollars, help the people. They just didn't happen. So if you think about it this way, these first bond offerings were like 2013, if I remember right. Details are hard to remember, it's been such a long time, but it's a lost decade for this country. Imagine if you lost an entire decade. And that's kind of how I think about it. There was a lost decade when Malaysia could have been so much further ahead. And then you have the small things that happen. I mean, the prime minister was ultimately pushed out of office. And there was some idea that maybe corruption was going to be curbed going forward. Maybe not so much. We've had a couple of changes of government since then. The prime minister was sent to prison. His sentence was halved more recently. So on the ground, I have a friend who's a reporter in Malaysia, and I said, so just over the weekend, so what's it feel like these days? What do people say? And he said, there was this real sense that corruption as status quo could not continue. So that was a change. But now with some of the clawing back and Jolo never having materialized, there's a weariness and a cynicism about whether you can ever really pin it down, and can we ever get what we should have in this country from what the people are doing. So that's hard to show. It's much easier to show, like from your point of view, like Leonardo DiCaprio, he played Jordan Belfort in the movie. He was given all these gifts by Jolo. Jolo got him Marlon Brando's Oscar. That was one of his gifts. He gave him a Picasso. He gave him a Basquiat. I mean, if someone's giving you those kind of gifts, wouldn't you think this is too good to be true? He did ultimately have to give those back to prosecutors, right? So,
David, how are you tackling that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big problem. And it's a big thing that we've struggled with in the writer's room about, yes, all of this stuff is, fun, but how do you show the cost to the country? And so we've kind of created a character who is a composite of some of the, there are various people who tried to stop Joe in Malaysia. And none of them ultimately had the power alone to be able to do that. But we've sort of stitched some of them together into a character who also, doesn't succeed. But therefore, we're able to kind of track some of the things that didn't happen through this character, and then ultimately there's a twist that, I mean, what's important also is that there were people who, a reporter, a guy named Kevin Moranis, who was the head of the Anti-Corruption Commission, his car was blown up, and so there are people who actually got killed, which is easier to show in a TV show. And so if we kind of stitch together a character who represents an opposition and who we can track some of these things that were lost, and then also gets killed, that's one way to try to have an impact on an audience.
it's also really relevant because the cover-up is part of what kind of got things going, right? Because when the story first broke that some of this had happened, there was money that had been filtered away, the prime minister tried to shut it down. He fired his attorney general, and this lead investigator, he was found not just murdered, but stuffed in an oil drum.
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone's ever been held responsible for that, although developments continue in the story forever. So that cover-up is really what spawned yet another investigation that ultimately led to the prime minister's downfall.
And ultimately spawned, a sort of people power revolution in the streets, where, as you say, people in Malaysia have suffered under a tremendous amount of corruption historically, and this was so visible and beyond the pale that it led to ordinary people taking a lot of risk. And there was a lot of pushback from Najib, and ultimately led to his losing the election, his party losing the election, I think for the first time
Yeah.
Umno
Yes,
lost,
yeah.
was in 2018, and then subsequently Najib has been arrested. But now Umno's back in power, and so it's a little hard to know. It doesn't feel like that progress. It's pretty clear that progress wasn't sustained.
You mentioned the culture of corruption in Malaysia. What I'd like to ask you is whether or not there's something about the financial culture the culture within the financial industry here in New York that enabled a fraud like this to happen, either from the point of view of what we were talking about before, sort of the DNA of avarice, or from the point of view of the relationships and the closeness and family, friends.
Yeah, I mean, I would say there's something really important about what does and does not get prosecuted and held into account that leads to future actions. In this case, right after the financial crisis, Goldman Sachs was trying to get big business in Asia. So Tim Leissner was, the man on the scene, the ever respectable, fake doctor, fake degree holder, was there building relationships, and someone introduced him to Jolo, and he was off and running. And what occurred there from a financial point of view, if you're interested in Wall Street, is just in the simplest of terms, Goldman Sachs agreed to underwrite these bonds, make sure they were sold, that Malaysia was going to issue at an extraordinary price. So like if it's $6 billion in bonds, like a normal Wall Street fee would be, anybody have any idea? Like maybe $60 million? Goldman took $600 million as its fee on that $6 billion. So it was a huge fee. So you can see why they were after the business, right? But that fee is so big that once again, to your point, like, is there something wrong with this? Like, why is it not the usual 1% fee? Why is it this huge markup fee? And they were eager after the financial crisis to make these kind of big deals. So certainly something smelled really bad from the very beginning. In the end, I would say Goldman Sachs had to pay some money, and it sounds like a lot, because billions of dollars sound like a lot, right? But for Goldman Sachs, it's not so much. It was $2.9 billion here in the US, fines and disgorgement, some of which went back to Malaysia, and it agreed to pay Malaysia additional billions. But more recently, it went to court in London and is an arbitration fighting to ever have to pay that back, because they're like, wait a minute, we were conned. These guys, we didn't know what was going on. And I just think you took $600 million. Wow. That's all I need to know. Right. So I think that culture where you're not holding the firms accountable creates something. And the other penalty here, by the way, is the US, and I think the Department of Justice deserves a real pat on the back, because they pursued this crime, and it was not a US-based crime. They call it the biggest kleptocracy in history that the Department of Justice ever tracked down. But they went after it through all these various jurisdictions, which is very complicated because information sharing is very complicated and all of that. And then when they got there, right, they did this case, but Goldman negotiated, there was talk about it might be an existential threat to the firm. They had done something so bad. In the end, their Malaysian office took a criminal plea, and their Malaysian office disappeared. For Goldman Sachs, it didn't really mean that much. So I do think there's something really problematic in our culture. It's not the first time we've seen these kind of deals where countries have gotten swept up in offering big bonds that they could then have trouble repaying, as this happened here. And something maybe needs to be done differently.
Yeah, the case was able to be prosecuted in the US because the funds moved through the US, and therefore started to fall under US jurisdiction. So the Department of Justice under Loretta Lynch decided to go after this and announce this big seizure in 2016, that they were going to go after these assets. And that's what was sort of the beginning of the end. And also Najib and UMNO couldn't really cover this up anymore or suppress it within Malaysia. But I also want to say that in terms of not having a consequence, you were talking a moment earlier about Tim Leissner, and Leissner not only was there the sort of $600 million fee and additional fees that Goldman got, but Leissner himself was getting a lot of payoffs in the tens of millions. Let me think. It's been a while since I looked at those numbers, but I would say 40 or 50 million, but that may not be true. And in any case, Lesnar, I still don't understand this. Lesnar flipped. So he decided to turn state's evidence and therefore testified against his underling, Roger Ng, who was the guy in the Malaysian office. So Ng has now been prosecuted and gone to jail, and I think he's in jail. And Lesnar is still like unprosecuted and kind of still hanging out. So that just seems really bad.
And he got to invest his money he made. You ever heard of this company called Celsius, the Celsius drinks? He owns a big stake in that. And actually, it's his ex-wife now who actually has it, Kimura, back to Kimura. It kind of always...
Baby fat.
Yeah, baby fat. So the money kind of appears, there's been a huge fight about this. In New York, they argued that she owned those shares outright from her own modeling career and her baby fat, whatever. And they're exes, but like a lot of the money in Celsius, he did really well. And that came to him because of his connections in the Malaysian 1MDB. He would have never had that otherwise. So he just seems to make money.
In our series.
Speaking of your series and financing, you started several years ago starting on this show, and there's been tremendous shifts in the industry. Can you talk to us about what's changed since you started and the challenges you're having?
So, when you say you're looking forward to seeing the show, me too. We are still in development. We've sort of fleshed out a first season. I have an idea for 3 seasons of this, and the industry has changed in many ways, one of which being that limited series, people are no longer so much buying these days. People want kind of ongoing series. And I feel like there's at least sort of 3 seasons here. But season 1 essentially ends with the seizure of the yacht. Around 2016, after Loretta Lynch announces that they're going to impound this stuff. And so initially, the idea was that we had a way to finance it and finance the whole season 1. That has become more difficult because the industry has shifted. We were in, even 3 years ago, or 2.5 years ago when I started this, we were still kind of in the age of peak TV. And during that period, there were a bunch of different, this kind of streamers and production entities that were competing to kind of make a splash. And so they weren't afraid to be losing money. And my friend, Elena Smith, who created the Apple series Dickinson, gave an interview recently where she said that essentially there was a $1 to $2 billion grant from these major media companies to individual artists to try and create something that was going to kind of make a sensation. And since subsequently, but even before the writer's strike of last year, but certainly since then, the media companies have retrenched a lot, and they have now decided, no, they have to become profitable, and their shareholders are not just letting them spend at the same rate as they did before. So it is harder to get this series made now. It's a big international, expensive show that would shoot on several continents. So we're still kind of struggling, we're now struggling with how we'll eventually bring this to life. And everybody is super happy with the script, so that's good. But now we have to figure out how to pay for it. And even before things got complicated in the business, we used to joke that maybe the series is secretly being financed by Jolo. Because he did disappear in 2018, and he we think we know where he is, and our former Wall Street Journal reporters who wrote Billion Dollar Whale believe that he will be extradited back to Malaysia. So assuming that happens, then that would be season 3.
I could have this conversation all night. Whether or not you wanted to is another matter, but I'm also very sensitive to the fact that we have many people here who I'm sure would like the opportunity to ask a question or two. So I would like to open things up to Q&A. If anybody has any questions, please raise your hand and we will get a microphone to you.
Great, thank you. Good evening. Thank you very much for the insightful talk. I was wondering, what kind of themes can we expect investigative journalists to be following in the next 5 years, especially in the business world? Since I think before the 2010s, there was a lot of accounting scandals. Then there was the crypto era. So what do you think we'll be seeing in the near future?
Ooh, I wish I could predict all of that. That would be fantastic. Some of it's going to come out of what we call machine learning, clearly. Really interesting, not just Sam Altman, but like how and who's got the power, who's buying up all the electrical computing access around the world right now so that they can power these kinds of incredible machine learning things. I think there's going to be a lot in that space. Money laundering never goes away, I'm sorry to say, or maybe for journalists, it keeps us going, and maybe for creative types. That's not really going to go away either. So I think, financial frauds, they'll be there. But clearly in this sort of like new techie space, there's going to be a lot. And then the other one, which is already true, but even more so, maybe feels related to you, but hacking. So much of what occurs right now comes because of the illegal, underhanded taking of information. That's going to be a big area.
Thank you.
Well, we were looking for the next question. I want to make a correction. I said a few answers ago, we were talking about Joe's birthday party in Vegas, and I said De Niro was there, and I meant to say DiCaprio. So I don't want him to be mad.
I think Jamie Foxx was there as well.
Yes, Jamie Foxx was there.
And we now know that everybody who was there, including like Paris Hilton, right?
Mm-hmm. Paris Hilton's
They were
wedding.
all paid to be there. They weren't there because they were friends with this like really boring character, Jolo. Nobody actually liked him, but he gave money to other public. Look, here's $100,000. And they're like, well, sure, I'll come to his birthday party and have some champagne. So he literally bought his friendships everywhere he went.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep, there's a mic coming
There's
towards
one
you.
coming.
For David, since the script is still we're in pre-production still, if I understand correctly, for this project, how many people, what's the team, what's the size of the team, how many people, how many writers have touched it? That kind of, just general idea.
Yeah, I wouldn't actually say we're even in pre-production. I would say we're in development. And it has been, so we're working with Westward, which is Bo Willimon's company, and another entity called SK Global, which financed Crazy Rich Asians and other things. So there's the executives from those entities. And we had a small writer's room. We still have a small writer's room, which is basically 5 writers, a consultant who's also a novelist, who is a Malaysian novelist, so he can also talk to us about story, which is great, and support staff, and that's about it.
Thank you. Yes. It's coming from behind, sir.
Hi, it's also for David. So we're at Columbia, where most freshmen or sophomores read Aristotle, Poetics, and his theory on how the audience of a drama gets sucked into the story, and only then can they really feel the full power of the transformation of their heart. You mentioned that's one of the reasons why you use your device. I think House of Cards obviously made it powerful way to engage the audience. other financial stories or political stories do the same divide. Do you think that's because the topic, the subject matter, being financial or political, is a little bit detail-oriented, and the audience is not really interested in that, and therefore that device works particularly well? Or was there another reason why you were drawn to it? Thanks.
It's an interesting question. I feel like, House of Cards, of course, wasn't a financial story per se. So the question was like, why does one use a narrator? And to what extent is a narrator useful when they're unreliable? Is one that I have been interested in most of my creative life. And I guess I like the idea in general. M. Butterfly also has an unreliable narrator. I like the power of narrative and constructed narrative to pull an audience in. So if you talk about Aristotle and this sort of notion of how you engage an audience, direct address, certainly in the theater, is a pretty effective way of kicking that off. And because you just have this sort of simple human connection of people sitting there, and then I start to talk to you. And it goes back to sort of theater's roots around the campfire. And then because I believe there are a lot of narratives in our culture which are not accurate or have been constructed or have some sort of a subliminal political or sociological purpose, then I'm also interested in this idea of unreliable narrators. Now, the question of, okay, when you translate the direct address to film and television, that happens less, more so lately. But I remember, like in Ferris Bueller, when Matthew Broderick turned to the audience for the first time, I was like, whoa, what's that all about? But I think we've started to see that technique can be very effective in film and television as well.
So as an editor, typically you would get an email that would have like a tip or pitch and then a quick line and then try to explain in a paragraph something that specific to this story and any story like it is so complex that it's too dense to get into in the format that you would normally work with. So it was, I guess, shared internally for you that you already had a trusted source for the story to start to unravel it. But when you have a complex story like this that has so many details, where do you start to try to explain what's going on, like without maybe feeling crazy or in a way that you're so far ahead of people on where the story is that no one will listen, or you're just kind of like flailing?
Well, you're right about one thing. You feel like you're crazy, because you don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, right? On the other hand, you're getting all these tidbits. Oh, there's this Jolo guy, and he's spending all this money. He's suddenly buying up real estate and art. And oh, the prime minister's wife, she takes the jet plane and goes on these incredible shopping sprees. So this is the kind of information you're getting. And no, we didn't have one trusted source coming to us. There was a whistleblower. I don't know if any of you have seen the documentary that was done on this, but there was a documentary, Man on the Run? Yeah. Man on the Run, that chronicles how some of this was exposed by a couple of journalists who were working. But that whistleblower came forward but offered to sell the information. And so publications, especially in the United States, we just don't pay for information. So we just knew there was somebody saying that something was bad out there. Literally, that's what you had to go from. So what do you have to do? Well, you gotta just do what we call shoe leather and start from the ground up. There's this character, Jolo, who seems to have a lot of money to spend. What's he buying? Let's go look at the documents. He's created a film company. There's a Red Granite Film Company. Who are the owners of it? Where is it incorporated or listed as a company? And who's the lawyer for it? You just start really tracking down all those details. And one of the things we do, we have a giant whiteboard, Mike, you might in the classroom, and we'd start putting up all the stuff on it. At one point, every night we had to write, do not erase, so no one from the cleaning company would ever erase it, because we're like, if we forget any of this, we will never be able to reconstruct it. And it started like, okay, so how did this money get to Abu Dhabi? And where did the Australia piece come from? And what about Luxembourg? And how did this get to Hollywood? And so we were literally doing arrows and putting the LLCs and trying to piece it all together. In hindsight, it may seem kind of simple, but at the time, there were just these little tiny threads, and you're just trying to find out everything you can about each one, and then figure out where they come together.
Hi. So can I just say this is? I mean, I've been very interested in financial crime, from everything from FTX to AIG, Wirecard, Enron, and so this is a really fascinating story. My question is for Winnie. So what's been, in terms of investigating financial crimes, what's the hardest aspect of it? And what are the challenges, and how do you begin, how do you say, okay, there's something wrong here? What's that first step which sort of guides the process along its way?
So the first step is something just smells bad, literally. Like we say, it smells bad that the prime minister's wife is living so high from modest backgrounds when the prime minister doesn't make that much money. She's getting money from somewhere. It smells bad. So that's your first step. The hard part is that in much of the world, and frankly in the US, as much so, if not more so, there's a lot of opacity in ownership. Like if you own a penthouse here in New York, right? You own it, you create an LLC, a limited liability company. I call it, My Penthouse LLC. And you have no idea who actually owns it, right? So trying to trace that information is really difficult. There are some moves in parts of the world to try to do something about that, but it's been very, very, very slow. We're starting to see a little bit of progress, but that is something that I think, transparency would be good for everybody. And if you own something, why are you not willing to have that be known? So that's one of the hardest things. Certain other things are bought and sold primarily because there aren't many records, like art. We were talking about watches earlier, or diamonds. Rajib's wife had a 22-carat pink diamond that was worth like 20-something million dollars.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yes, there's also a piece that Joe bought her, the Princess Di necklace,
Right.
Which was the one that, who was she married? Who was she going to marry?
Dodi Fayed.
Thank you. Bought for her just before they had the crash in Paris.
Yeah, so, and art in particular, like Sotheby's and Christie's for a year profited off the fact that people buy and sell art by having someone buy and sell it for them, and it's not really clear who the owner is. So all of that opaque stuff makes it really hard to track things down. But especially for companies, it'd be nice if there was a registry. And so that's the hardest part of it by far. AIG, that was an accounting thing I could talk about. Wirecard also had some opaque issues. But that is the primary challenge, not just to journalists, but to prosecutors, right, who are trying to get to the bottom of something. People say, how was the billion-dollar whale ultimately covered? How did you piece it all together? Hey, it took subpoena power, right? That's how it was all pieced together ultimately. Because all you could do is say, this looks interesting, this looks weird, here's pieces of it. But it really took somebody who could delve in and put together those records that weren't available for the average person.
Hi. I would like to thank you both for this discussion tonight. But my question is, what key takeaways or insights you'd like for the audience to have after watching these types of doc-series?
I mean, ideally, entertainment can be a way to illuminate and create an awareness of these sorts of issues that you're talking about. I mean, what does it mean? If we have a Tim Leisner character, and he's clearly at the center of this, and he's clearly not only a bigamist, but also taking money from all sides, and yet he doesn't end up having to be. He doesn't end up going to court. He doesn't end up, it may yet happen, but we'll see. Then I think that that's a very visceral impact on an audience that also happens to illustrate the flaws in our American system of financial justice as well as the international finance system. One could argue that one of the reasons Joe was able to get away with all of this is because the numbers were so big. Like if you try and sneak $10,000 into the country, then you might get caught. But if you're moving $700 million, then there's no incentive in terms of you have regulators, but those regulators have relatively little power, and all of the motivation from these financial institutions is to try to make this happen because they all benefit. So the regulators, even though there are laws, don't ultimately have the power to stop this from happening. And that's one of the things that we can illustrate grammatically, which hopefully can have the side effect, besides entertaining an audience, of giving them a little insight into some of the problems with our financial system.
Thank you. We have time for one last question. I think there was somebody here at the front.
Thanks. This is a journalistic question. We're focusing so much on the illegality and fraudulent aspects of the finance world and the like, but how about all the legal things that go on that are also, I think, ripe for looking at? I mean, the private equity industry, the hedge fund industries in America are such, they're key forces in the sort of generating a lot of the problems we have in terms of inequality and the concentration of wealth. And I mean, these are just ripe subjects that I think, if we focus so much on money laundering and hacking, do not get the attention they deserve. So, just a thought.
Thank you. There was a question? Did you have, yeah.
So you mentioned that a lot of these frauds go on for a long time, and this one may even still be unfolding. How do you let go of a story and move on to the next one? Whether that be Enron, whether that be Madoff, whether that be this one. How do you know when to stop and to move on?
Journalists tend to be obsessive. They never let go, quite frankly. The reporter who worked on the Madoff story for me at the New York Times, Diana Enriquez, she stayed with Madoff for years and years and years until ultimately he agreed to see her in prison, ultimately, right? That was years later, many years later. So yeah, I think you stick with them as much as you can. At some point you have to move on because there's other stories that need to be told, right? So that kind of pushes you forward. But if you're a good journalist, I hope that you're going back and still checking in with the people you reported on in the big stories, weeks later, months later, years later, kind of seeing what happened. And maybe that helps you be a better journalist to understand how things unfold over long periods of time.
David, how do you move on?
I move on because at some point they make me stop writing. So if I'm doing a show, I love to rewrite, and I will rewrite through previews, and then at some point you have to freeze the show because the critics are coming. And my most frequent collaborator, the director Lee Silverman, she says, "Oh, that's David's unhappiest day." And so, yeah, at some point you have to open the thing, you have to shoot the thing, you have to release the thing.
You have to publish.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much. I really appreciate
Thank you.
your time.